we have a very distinguished panel on the topic that is, well, one of the hottest topics of the day, which is leveling the playing field in the global context. I have pulled together just a few headlines on the topic, and this is by no means comprehensive and by no means indicative of my own views on the subject matters, but really just a snapshot of the topics that we will be talking about. This sentiment about European competition rules not necessarily always helping European businesses to compete on the global scale has been bubbling for a while. And I'd say, especially when it came to state aid issues, we have been hearing that for quite some time. But what caused a bit of a seismic move, I would say, really was when the European Commission blocked the Siemens transaction. And then we suddenly started seeing this sort of a wave of calls for changes to our existing competition regime. And we saw a lot of proposals coming from member states, and then other member states stepping into the debate, arguing that perhaps the total overhaul is not justified, and so on and so forth. But then came the new commission, and it became very clear that European competitiveness, European digital sovereignty have become perhaps among the key or like central pillars of the European strategy for this commission. COVID adjusted those priorities, but the commission has pressed on with some of the proposals, and we will be discussing about them in a moment. And I think this is where I stop talking and invite Monique to perhaps do a little bit of scene-setting remarks on the leveling the playing field in the global context, and which role is for competition enforcement here, Monique?
Thank you so much, Evelina. Thank you all. Good morning. And thank you, Evelina, for organizing this event. It's an honor to participate, especially at this moment, because I think we are living in historic times of historic importance as a society as a whole, but also for competition and the role of competition. The debate on the role of competition is not new, I would say. We all know the discussion already for years. Is competition there, competition law enforcement there to protect competition? Or is it there to protect the internal market, or to protect the competitors, or to enhance consumer welfare? And I think already over the last years, attention to this question was increased for a number of reasons. We have discussions in the broader context of sustainability and climate change, in the context of the effects of globalization and digitization on the industrial policy. In Europe, we are still reflecting on the effects of Brexit and the increasing protectionism. And then, as you said, then we have Corona, the COVID-19. And I think as a result of all of that, worldwide, questions are being asked about the influence of big tech and also recently of big pharma. And the concern we feel at times is that our consumers, companies, and our society, we are totally at the mercy of some big enterprises for the entrance to markets, and also for the supply of goods and services, for the supply of information, even of news. And this feeling has grown to such an extent that in the EU and in the US, the question is being posed whether it's not time to change the rule on competition. And I think that's indeed historic. We've never been this far before. But as we all know also, altering the rules takes time. And fortunately, at least that's my view, fortunately, within the realm of competition enforcement, there's also some space for competition authority and for development of competition law. And at the ACM, We have embraced this space, for example, in the practice or in the discussions on sustainability. We have proposed a sustainability initiative. As you all know, under the traditional rules of competition, plans of competitors to commonly or collectively enhance into projects that are good for the nature, for sustainability, they quickly come up against the applicable cartel regime rules. And we have forced this debate to shift the debate, arguing that the benefits of such initiatives can also come for the society as a whole and for future generations, and therefore should also be taken into account when assessing the competition impacts. This debate is still being placed, has not been finished, but it's interesting to see how there is space to develop competition law enforcement in our view. At the same time, the battle against COVID-19 has raised new questions on cooperation. I think that's here the word cooperation, on the possibilities for companies to cooperate, and it also has demanded shift reactions from the competition authorities. And there, I think competition authorities have shown over the last months that they are fit for purpose in this regard. Only last week, for example, at the ACM, we issued an opinion on how health insurance companies could cooperate temporarily in order to share for 2020 the extra healthcare costs that they had incurred in order to tackle COVID-19. That's cooperation, but I think COVID-19 has not only shown us the necessity maybe to cooperate, but also that we as a society see the effects of free competition, and sometimes that has the effect that we feel increasingly dependent on large company to an undesirable level, and that has sharpened the already existing debate which you already mentioned on the need to maybe ascribe an extra dimension to the European industrial policy and maybe consumer protection. So to conclude, I see that there is some room for development in the course of normal enforcement, but that other developments may require a change of the rules and new instruments in order to reach the desired effect. And at the roots of this debate are discussions, I think, that reach further than the traditional debate on the goal of competition. And there, I think it becomes really interesting because the debate is not only on economics and effectiveness, it's more, it's on norms and it's on principles, including fairness, including privacy, and maybe even including free speech. And then the questions come up. What public interests do we want to protect in today's society? And to what extent can they be served by competition law, amended or not? Or to what extent may these rules have to be completed by rules on consumer protection or market regulation? So I would like to say, Evelina, working in competition has never been as excited as this today, and it is certainly so when you work for a multifunctional competition authority like I do. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Cristina, is it really not only about economics and efficiency, and which role is for competition enforcement in your view when it comes to leveling the playing field in the global context?
Thank you, Evelina, for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here with a group of fantastic women. I need to say what I think is appropriate in these cases. Disclosure is very important for people who work for companies. As everyone knows, I work adverse to Google. I don't work for or against Facebook. I work for a number of other platforms. But what I'm about to say is entirely my view. They don't like what I have to say. I don't care. And my views are entirely mine, as everyone knows when I speak. So I think I second many of the things that Monique just said. We are in a time where we basically have a gigantic under construction sign basically across the competition playground. The rules are changing, and it is true, as Monique says, that we've interrogated ourselves about the role of competition law for years, but the pace has accelerated. We are no longer at the point at which we are asking whether we should change, but how we should change. And factors that I certainly don't need to repeat in detail that have accelerated this this renewed interest into changing the rule. Of course, have got to do with the COVID crisis, in the sense that we have seen particularly digital companies in the current time becoming even bigger, even more powerful. Of course, they performed a wonderful role, they've done useful things to society, but in the process, we have witnessed situations in which the top 4 or 5 large digital platform account in terms of market cap for over a quarter of the US stock market. They account for more than the value of the European stock market. Their revenue is bigger than the GDP of Switzerland. So we're talking about something which is of a dimension which is almost difficult to comprehend. And it isn't just size, of course, that we worry about. It is the concentration of economic and ultimately political power, right? Because certainly what makes a lot of us anxious is this notion that some of these business models are driven by incentives that are not benign. Some go as far as talking about them as toxic, and I sort of subscribe to that view, because in some of these business model, we know that conspiracy theories, fake news, addiction, hate speech, misinformation make every click more valuable, attract attention, and that's what really is being sought for here. And I don't need to go through the experience we're living through with the American election, but just think about the Vienna terrorist attack 2 days ago. We are in a world in which Facebook spontaneously sets up a crisis center and invites people to post reactions and photographs on this site, while the Vienna police is pleading with people not to do so, because that interferes with the investigation. So we are in a world in which content moderation and interference into the political speech and democracy is a serious problem. But beyond that, of course, we worry about economic power. And again, I don't need to remind this group and the attendees here, but we're worried about certainly envelopment of other markets from a position of markets that already have tipped. Social networking is tipped, search is tipped, and they are extending their power. We're talking about unfair bargains in respect of citizens and businesses that depend on these platforms. We are talking about mergers that are systematically sucking up startups, and this is certainly a problem in terms of the direction and pace of innovation. We're talking about innovation that no longer is diffuse and neutral, but ultimately is directed by the preferences of the platforms. You only innovate in a way that is compatible with what's there, because otherwise you don't sell, but that is a bias to the direction of innovation. So all of this is the background against which we are sort of essentially considering where we are. There is a sense that, of course, you mentioned and others have mentioned that despite early activism on the part of DG Comp, we have failed as Europeans to really move the dial, and that is to do in part with the limitation of 102 as a tool for remedies design, and in part also with timidity, lack of confidence, and some sort of fatigue with the remedies as they were designed. Bottom line, we have started really well. The cases were good, but they delivered absolutely nothing. That as well as contributed to where we are now, which is essentially a sense that we need to absolutely review the way we do things and change the way we do things. Another factor which is very pertinent to this discussion, as you mentioned as well in your introduction, is fundamentally the geopolitical dimension, the political economy. What we have seen is Britain, the UK with Brexit, weighing anchor and drifting into the Atlantic. What you have been left, and this is my own personal view, in Europe is essentially a Franco-German bloc. No one else really counts. These are the kind of powers that effectively set the rules, and there is a big, strong French view, which is, of course, Macron, Breton, Castex, or that wants to provide a real direction to a French view of regulation. I think Germany has been a little concerned about this, but are kind of coming on board. And we know there is this enormous amount of rules which are being drafted feverishly into Connect, into Grow, which are the parts of the Commission where you really do policy making a bit more than Comp, of course, which is an enforcer. So you have this big phenomenon, which is driven ultimately by an industrial vision for digital in Europe. Europe feels, and this is certainly a French view, but also shared by others, certainly surrounded by, on the one hand, the American giant, and on the other hand, the Chinese marauding, and we need to pursue our own interests, which essentially are about, we have given up on digital platforms that face consumers, we need to not give up and in fact state and assert our power when it comes to industry. We want B2B data to be able to be shared. We want data sovereignty, data autonomy, data centers in Europe, not in Arizona. And this is very much the background and the big component to the regulation. And of course, in the face of all this kind of regulation, enormous freight train that is coming across the track, you have the competition agencies reacting quite strongly, right? DG Competition has kind of jumped up and down and said, we need to do something. We need our new competition tool in order to plug the gap in enforcement that we have, because 102 is pretty useless, frankly, when it comes to these kind of markets. We'll discuss it later in the panel. But you also kind of see, interestingly, and I'm sure that others in the panel can comment, I can comment very freely to this. What is interesting is a narrative that is out there right now in which you have Andreas Mondt, Isabel de Silva saying, well, you know, what is all this regulation stuff? We can do it as agencies, right? You know, look at the 10th Amendment to the German competition law. It is competition law plus, said Andreas Mondt. It's a regulatory hybrid already. It complements very well whatever we used to do in the past. So we as competition agencies can actually do the job. We don't need all this enormous, crazy sort of regulatory stuff. But, you know, we'll live with some of that. And to conclude, I wanted to spend a couple of words on the US part, because I sort of straddle the two worlds in some sense, and wanted to say, we're also watching what's happening over there with incredible interest, because of course you had the permafrost on enforcement in the US for 20 years, nothing happened. Then you had the House Judiciary Committee, Lina Khan in brief, and then you have the DOJ dropping the complaint against Google. So things appear to be moving, and they appear to be moving in a direction that says we need to change the laws because the case law is obsolete, is decrepit, it is completely against enforcement in this space. We need Congress to tell DOJ and FTC to actually do your job. We need to give them more resources. So this is kind of promising. Final point, what's going to happen with these elections? Because actually, everything I hear is the big platforms are quite happy with the Dem administration, right? The House Judiciary Report was bipartisan, true, but the big platforms are not particularly scared, notwithstanding the rhetoric of the progressive about a Biden-Harris ticket. And I'll leave it at that, but there is a sense that we're okay. We're okay with them. We'll work with them. And in fact, we will make them tell the Europeans not to bother American companies as much as they're doing. So there is a potential for things to actually not converge that much. And perhaps with this initiative in favor of entrustment in the antitrust enforcement in the US to slow down with the new administration and favor actually the platforms and for Europe to try and go ahead with regulation and therefore the gap to be wide again. So I think this will be fascinating to watch. Indeed, the chief economist at the Lina Khan event I had a week ago actually said, I think in Europe we're going actually a bit too fast when it comes to regulation. We should slow down a bit because Americans need to catch up. So that is the piece to watch. Thank you.
Sounds like quite a few pieces to watch, quite some scene setting. I don't know if we will manage to plow through all of that in the remaining time that we have allocated. But, and we will come back to digital because it is, of course, a very, very important part of the discussion we are having today. But before we move on, Elsa, did you have any reactions from an in-house perspective on a lot that's been said in preceding minutes?
Indeed, and hello everyone. Thanks for having me with you today. It's absolutely my privilege to be here on this esteemed panel. And I will just say that I'm speaking also in my personal capacity. What I say today is not necessarily representative of AT&T's views, but with that out of the way, and thanks for the fascinating perspectives, which indeed from both Monique and Cristina, I think we could be here all day discussing all of them. I would actually propose taking a slightly different tack, more of a pragmatic view from the in-house perspective. I mean, clearly we are living through this time of considerable uncertainty and change on all fronts. The US elections are one example, but only one example of that. And this uncertainty, I think, makes us as individuals crave more stability in our lives. But that is also a narrative that applies from the perspective of business, and perhaps even more so. Because I think it's important to remember in all of this that it is, typically speaking, stability and certainty that delivers the optimum conditions for investment and innovation. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that as we evolve legislative frameworks going forward. I mean, I and others, no doubt, industry in general recognises that competition law, like any other branch of law and regulation, faces new challenges and new pressures. Digital clearly being a very key and important example of that, and we'll come back to that later. And in the event of any change, there is always going to be winners and there's always going to be losers. And inevitably, each business will have its own views on the direction of the change and a legitimate interest in framing the debate. I wouldn't propose to go into the nitty-gritty of the substance today, but we can come back to certain points. But generally speaking, I think it's important to restate my high-level point that, in general, I think it's fair to say that business values most of all flexibility, freedom, fairness, to develop and deploy their offerings as widely as possible. And again, for most businesses, perhaps not all, but certainly for the vast majority, to compete on the merits in their respective spheres. That is what industry is there for. That is what businesses are set up to do. And to do that, it's important to remember that businesses need certainty. What they need is clarity. We need clear, predictable, and understandable rules that allow businesses to plan ahead, to execute on their business plans, and then through doing that, to provide continuous and reliable delivery of the services and goods to their customers. That again is their raison d'être. And with that in mind, I think it's fair to say that business in general has a powerful incentive to keep subjective matters such as politics and industrial policy out of regulation to the extent possible. And I think that applies in competition enforcement as in many, many other fields. To put it differently, I think essentially what the vast majority of businesses want and need is clear rules that we can follow and adapt to, and it's as simple as that. And so, as we discuss all of these global, important, crucial issues and potential changes to a regulatory framework, and indeed, perhaps even more importantly, the subsequent enforcement of any changes that are introduced, we need to be carefully balancing the perceived need for change with the legitimate interests of business, who are ultimately the subjects of regulation in this sphere, to certainty and to clarity. And I suppose if I were able to condense that all into one ask to the esteemed members of the panel who are in a position to influence policy change, basically just to emphasize that any changes of this sort do need to be developed and introduced in a phased manner, not precipitously, not haphazardly. And if perhaps consensus is too much to hope for, then at least a full and frank consultation with all stakeholders. That's very much what we're seeing with the European Commission and with many of the member states at the moment, as we work towards a DSA or DMA or whatever umbrella and acronym we will eventually have for it. And I would just, continue to keep up the good work in that regard and to bring industry with you, to listen to all of the perspectives and to make full and informed decisions so that any change can be transparent and predictable. And as such, continue to deliver that environment that's conducive to investment and to business and ultimately to consumers.
Thank you very much, Elsa. Predictability, stability, clarity, and I think that's also why, before we move to talk about the various proposals that have been put on the table, maybe we can sort of stop for a moment and look at what national tools currently exist and how competition authorities have been using them, and to what extent they lend themselves to level the playing field. And I think it would be good to spend a few minutes to talk about merger control in particular, because it was the merger control case that sort of triggered the whole debate to begin with. Silke, let's start with you. The Bundeskartellamt decision in the CRR Oslo case. What can you tell us about it?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to talk to such a distinguished, together with such a distinguished panel. Yeah, it's a bit change of levels now, going into such a nitty-gritty, detailed case. But I hope I can take you with me for some reflections on this case. Now, in April this year, we cleared this merger, the acquisition of the German shunter manufacturer Vossloh by the Chinese rolling stock manufacturer CRRC. And this case actually had two specificalities. Firstly, it was foreseeable that the market shares of both the target and the acquiring company would change during the forecast period. And secondly, CRRC being a state-owned company was a specific factor that had to be looked at in more detail in this case. That's what we felt, at least, and that's what we did. So we looked at the numerous factors regarding that are relevant if you have a company like CRRC, which is not only a state-owned company, but it's a state-owned company with a centrally planned economy. And this kind of made it rather clear, and that's what we saw in the assessment, that the whole strategy of the company was very much politically oriented. So I do have to say that, of course, even though we try to look at what factors we would need to take into account in a merger case, there are various distortions of competition mentioned by European manufacturers in the course of the proceeding that rather relate to totally different issues and not competition or merger review, more on trade policy issues or on procurement law issues. So those we left aside. But very generally, what we did see is that the scope of action and the limits differ substantially between private companies and state-owned companies in centrally planned economies. And this is especially the case if the state in question, like this is the case with China, announces a strategy of expanding into markets in third countries by using state-owned companies. So what seemed to be relevant for the merger assessment were two issues. First, the sheer size of the affiliated group of companies, horizontally and vertically integrated and creating vast economies of scope. Now, under German competition law, we have an affiliation clause that is rather decisive when it comes to assessing the size of such an affiliated group. And China indirectly holds the majority in CREC's shares, and the investigations have also shown that it is the express intention of the intermediary state bodies to exert influence on essential aspects of the economic conduct of its affiliates, and all of that based on the provisions set out in the current actual 13th five-year plan of China. Now, for a merger case, in first instance, this is relevant for the question of what you need to give as obligatory information in the merger notification, because this means that we really need a view on this affiliate group. This is actually, as we have learned, especially in the case of China, a very difficult exercise for anybody trying to notify a merger, because for a European-based law firm, it's not easy to get the details that you might be needing for such a notification. And of course, more relevantly even, this information is necessary in order to really assess the merger, because, and that we have found also in this case and others, the information that you are given in first instance does differ from the information that you get when you continue asking. And this is also relevant information on the scope of action of the affiliate company as a whole. And now the second point that we looked at was the ability and willingness of the acquiring company here to implement low price strategies. And so I'm talking about low price strategies that are anti-competitive, that remain, that are not fully based on comparative cost advantages in the medium term, and that thus could really damage competitive structures. Now, again, here, it is clear that not all low price strategies are a competitive problem and create structural problems. Most market entry strategies will be accompanied by low price strategies, and that's a good thing. So we have to differentiate that in a meaningful way. What we did look at is that what the capabilities and the incentives for implementing such strategies could be in this case. And we looked at access to resources and conduct in the past. And the assessment of both issues indicated here that CRC has the capabilities and has applied such anti-competitive low price strategies in the past. Now, in the end, all these circumstances were not relevant in this case because of the specific developments on the relevant markets here. We had seen that the target company actually had a very unstable market position due to lacking investments into innovative drive technologies in the recent years, whereas European-based competitors had newly entered this market and seemed to be catching up. And CRC did not contribute any innovative technology, only vast resources. So in the end, we cleared this merger, but we took the case as an opportunity to look at how we could actually look more closely onto a state-owned company of such a centrally planned economy.
Thank you, Silke. Saar, from in-house perspective, what reflections you might have on this Bundeskartellamt assessment and perhaps including the importance of assessing state subsidies as part of merger control assessment?
Yeah, indeed, Evelina, and for us, obviously, in view of the Commission's prohibition in the Siemens Alstom case, as you know, we brought forward a number of those arguments. It's not a nitty-gritty detailed case. It's a very important case, and it's a very welcomed development. And to be honest, to my knowledge, it's really the first merger control case where a competition authority actually made a very in-depth assessment of the potential impact that state support can have on the dynamics of competition on the market, and obviously we've been advocating for that together with a number of other industry players and some very outspoken national governments. I think that such kind of assessment should really be included in merger control cases going forward, because indeed it can have significant impacts. Now, if I look specifically to the assessment that the German Federal Cartel Office made in the case, I personally think it's extremely different from what the European Commission actually did in our case, in the Siemens Alstom case, where, at least in my view, and I think I've mentioned that already several times, I did not have the feeling, or at least I haven't seen any detailed assessment by the Commission of the potential impact of state support, in particular then in our case in relation to the likelihood or the increased likelihood of potential entry. Now, if you look at the decision of the German Federal Cartel Office in the CRRC case, I think they picked up a number of, or they reviewed at least a number of the arguments that we brought forward back then also in front of the European Commission, and that obviously is because they believe that those elements can potentially have an effect on competition. And I really want to praise also the Federal Cartel Office in that regard, because I think they took a very realistic and a very pragmatic approach when assessing actually the impact of state support. And I fully appreciate this is not an easy assessment, because very often there's a lack of transparency. And I don't want to repeat what Silke said, but I think indeed the fact, if we're dealing with state-owned companies, they don't function like normal companies. In most of the cases, they pursue very clearly defined political goals, which are backed by massive subsidies. And as Silke mentioned, obviously, in particular in the Chinese, there are 5 years plans, and they have very clear goals to also expand and become leading players outside of the Chinese market. And again, this is a point where, from our perspective, this has not been reflected on by the European Commission in our case. The other point which I found evidence of really a very realistic approach, to be honest, is indeed, as Silke mentioned, they looked at past practices, they looked at dumping cases, they looked whether in the past there's any proof of low pricing strategies. They specifically looked, for example, at the example that CRRC entered the US metro market in the past, and then they've actually entered just a few years ago, and they were willing to, or able actually to win practically all of the projects in that market, build up significant production capacity, which until today is completely unmatched by any other rival. And that's only possible because they have such a state subsidies, and because they're looking and trying to pursue their political goals. So overall, I think this is a very welcomed development for the industry as a whole. And I do hope, obviously, that we see more of that also at the level of other competition authorities, including also the European Commission. It fits very well, we're looking at trying to level the playing field. We're looking at the moment at several different instruments, and I think merger control should definitely be one part of that instrument, where, from my perspective, it's really essential to the extent it's relevant and it plays a role that we're looking at the potential impact of state support, not only on, the market, but also on, in terms of, potential entry. So, well, yeah, happy to have seen that, and hope we see more of that in the future.
Thank you, Saar. Monique, whilst we're at merger control, you do have rules in the Netherlands that I think not many member states do have, allowing a minister to reverse a merger prohibition invoking public interest grounds. And I understand there have been some interesting developments in the Netherlands in that respect. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Certainly, Evelina, I would like to contribute to this discussion by setting out a recent example in the Netherlands of state intervention in a domestic merger case. Stepping back, in the Netherlands, the ACM is entrusted with merger control. And in our merger assessment, we apply an economic test, which is similar to the test applied by the European Commission under the present merger control regulation. However, the national law permits explicitly the Minister of Economic Affairs to intervene on public interest grounds. That's to say, the minister may overrule a prohibition decision of the National Competition Authority. And only last year, the minister used this power for the first time in history. And what happened? We blocked a merger. We blocked a merger of a formerly state-owned postal company and its rival. They wanted to merge, and we blocked it because, according to our assessment, prices would go up as a result of the merger. Then the minister overruled this decision, and the minister justified his decision by referring to the need of preserving employment and to ensure reliable postal services in a shrinking market. The legal system is clear, and of course we respect this right of the minister to intervene and approve the merger on these public interest grounds. However, and that's where it becomes more interesting, I think, also, two smaller postal operators brought an appeal before the national courts to annul the decision of the minister. And in June, the district court in the Netherlands annulled this decision, claiming that the minister did not provide sufficiently reasoned arguments for his authorization. And the minister appealed this decision for the higher court. I'm not in the position to comment on this case. It's still under appeal, but I think the case is interesting in that it shows how difficult the weighing of different public interests is, and that there is a delicate interplay between the competition authority, the minister, and the courts. As I said, the law is clear. We have to do an assessment of the economic impact of the merger, and the way to be given to the other public interest is for the minister. So also the minister has to weigh the negative impact of the merger, the negative economic impact of the merger against other legitimate interest. And it's the courts then to review this balancing decision of the minister. And the courts have shown to be very thorough. They regard a sound and substantiated reasoning of the minister. And in my view, this legal review is of crucial importance. It's an important part of a system of checks and balances, and it accentuates the credibility of the competition authority. And I was reflecting a bit on this case in relation to the recent proposals of maybe amending the EU merger rules. Merger control, of course, requires a fairly swift decision-making. And weighing up the effects of a merger, the economic effects against other public interests, is a very difficult and delicate job, and highly subject, I think, also to political pressure. So should the Commission or the European Council be awarded the task of including other public interests besides that of competition, the same delicate job has to be taken place at the EU level. And I think also there, checks and balances will be important, crucial for the process, and also legal review, in my view, will have to be vital, will be vital. And we have to be very careful there, I think, because it would certainly be a step back, I think, if the EU institutions were proved to be open for short-term political wins against long-term economic sustainability. And that would certainly not be a stimulus, I think, for national authorities and political bodies which have the same powers, would not be the right stimulus for them, let's say. So also for this reason, I think we have to be very careful when changing the approach to merger control regulation.
Just a quick follow-up question, Monique. How long did it take for the court to take a decision, roughly?
Fairly quickly, and it's interesting because we originally had this conference in March, and then I would have said the minister overruled, and there is just an appeal has been launched, and in June it was decided. So it was fairly swift. I think this December last year till June, so say 6 months or so, roughly. Yeah. But it's very quickly, I would say.
I don't suspect we can ever hope for that kind of check and balances on the EU level.
Then the appeal now.
The swiftiest of proceedings.
But the second step, because we do have an appeal that was launched fairly quickly after this first decision by the minister, and we will have hearings in March next year. Mm-hmm. We don't play a formal role in those proceedings, I have to say that, but we can be asked questions on the economic assessment that we did.
Well,
so it's the first time.
The minister. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Silke, I understand that you have a similar rule in Germany as well. I don't know if you had any thoughts to add, or would you rather pass on to the next topic?
That's up to you with regard to timing. Would you? I think
we still have a couple of minutes. So if you have some reflections on
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, this ministerial decision is something I'm afraid that the Dutch colleagues have kind of seen in the German law when they drafted their law at the end of the 1990s last year. Actually, we have this instrument in our competition law since the 70s of the last year, and maybe also you have to see that at that time there wasn't much merger control around. It was, I think, it was far before European merger control, and at that time maybe even you needed something like that in order to be able to introduce a merger control regime at national level. Anyhow, how is this concept in Germany? The basic idea for introducing this was always to make sure that the competition authority can really look at competition issues only, and that there is no room for political pressure from other political stakeholders, because that would then be part of the ministerial procedure and not of the competition authority. It was very much to make sure that there is a pure competition view on the merger assessment. Anyhow, at the time it was felt that there needs to be an escape possibility, because there might be individual cases where you would need to overrule such a pure competition assessment. So the regime is such that the minister can, on application, authorize a merger prohibited by the Bundeskartellamt. It's not from out of his own decision to do that, but there needs to be an application by the parties. And he can then give such an authorization if the restraint of competition is outweighed by advantages to the economy as a whole, resulting from the concentration. So these are the points that the minister has to show. That is one option, or if the concentration is justified by an overriding public interest, which is then specifically has to be shown. However, the limitation is the authorization may not be granted if the scope of the restraint of competition, it may only be granted if the scope of the restraint of competition does not jeopardize the market economy as a whole. So that's a bit the setting. There is checks and balances in our system, especially because the German Monopolies Commission has always have to be asked for a view, and this is given in writing and it is public, so there is a public debate possible on all of this. And actually there are possibilities to challenge the decision of the minister in court. This has happened in the past, and I must say that the first time that this has happened, this has led to changes in the competition law in two directions, and that was the last amendment of the law. The minister now has to justify any deviation from the opinion of the Monopolies Commission, and I think this also has to be done publicly. And but on the other side, the possibilities for third parties to challenge such a decision have been reduced. So a party really needs to have a specific, personal interest in such a decision. Otherwise, the appeal is not allowed. Now, since the last amendment, we've had another case, and this has given reason for a new amendment proposal in the competition law. That's in the 10th amendment now, and which introduces a new precondition for applying for a ministerial organization in the first place. So now parties, if this amendment goes through Parliament, parties will have to challenge the prohibition decision of the Bundeskartellamt in court first, and then after a decision or after a preliminary decision of court, they can go to the minister. This is because in the recent case, the parties tried to more or less challenge the competition decision before the minister. And he wasn't really so much amused by this approach, I think. So you see that it's a very difficult instrument. I think since the 1970s, we've had 23 cases in Germany. 10 of those, the minister has authorized, 7 have been withdrawn, and 6 have been decided negatively by the minister. So you see, it's not always a win-win case for the parties when they come with such an appeal to the minister.
And I suspect it also takes a bit longer than 6 months in Germany.
Well, I think there is a time limit actually on the ministerial procedure. But it's really a hard time for the minister, I think, because I mean, it's his personal decision. He has to take it, and he really has to be present at oral hearings and all these kind of things. So it's a really tough time.
We have a question from the audience, which I think anticipates our next theme for discussion. It comes from Edurne Navarro. What do you think about the EC white paper about control of state aid for companies from third countries? Should it be a solution to the issues identified by Saar and Silke? And so let's try to see if we can answer that with delving into the proposal by the European Commission on foreign subsidies, the so-called white paper. And Saar, since you were called out in the question, do you want to start?
Yes, I can perhaps indeed. I mean, give a few comments on the white paper, and for those who aren't very familiar with this new white paper, perhaps a few introductory comments to actually explain what this white paper is all about. And it actually aims at also installing some kind of new instrument to address distortions of the internal market, which are arising from foreign subsidies. And as most of you probably know, it consists of 3 different models. The first one will actually deal with, it's kind of a general market scrutiny model that will allow the European Commission or the competent authorities, and we'll get to that, to review potentially distortive foreign subsidies. The second module deals with acquisitions by companies that are actually benefiting from foreign subsidies. And I think the third model relates to the impact of foreign subsidies on procurement. And I think today probably we would like to focus a bit more on module 1 and perhaps a bit on module 2, because it's the I think it are, at least for us as antitrust lawyers, the more important models. And just as a starting point, I think generally the industry, and we've also been talking with a number of other companies and discussing on the view of the industry on this instrument, I think generally it's very much welcomed. We do think it's a good way forward to potentially also obviously outbalance those the impact of foreign subsidies on the internal markets that cannot be tackled under the normal state aid rules, which obviously only apply here on subsidies provided within Europe. So that would be the difference, or one of the difference, obviously. Now, that being said, we also believe very strongly that it's very important that the Commission strikes the right balance there, and that we do not move into the direction of over-regulation. Because, if you would cast the net basically too wide, it could potentially lead, again, as what Elsa said, to legal uncertainty, and that's obviously very detrimental usually to companies. It's something companies don't like, and it might even have a negative effect on investment in Europe, and that's going to be very clearly counterproductive to the aim of all those initiatives. Now, when the Commission actually launched its public consultation, it floated a number of ideas on how those different models could actually look like, and as with each and every public consultation, I think it always triggers a very heavy debate amongst the stakeholders. You have very extreme positions there, and perhaps I would like to pick up 3 different debates, I think 3 important points that are currently being debated, and share with you also the industry's view, or the general industry's view on those 3 points. And to start with, I think the beginning, I think one of the major questions is really, what kind of foreign subsidies will actually fall within the scope of this instrument and can be caught by this instrument. And there, I think, again, to avoid this kind of over-regulation, which will create massive legal uncertainty for companies, we believe that only those subsidies that actually are high enough to have a material impact on the internal market should actually be caught by the tool. The Commission mentioned in its consultation the 200,000 threshold, which I think is the one that we have now currently under the de minimis state aid rules. Our personal view, or my personal view, is that that threshold is too low and should be significantly increased. I think another interesting point of debate is which authority will actually be competent to enforce this instrument. And obviously there are different options. You can either lay that competence with national authorities, you can do it with the European Commission, or you can have a mix of both, basically, like we know it with the referral system, for example, like we know it on the merger control rules. And again, there, I think the industry very clearly goes into the direction that we would have a very strong preference that this tool is being implemented and applied to solely by the European Commission. And obviously I'm happy to hear Silke's and Karin's view on that. I think we fear that, if national authorities are able to implement this and apply this tool, that we will see a big diversion between the different approaches taken at national level. And perhaps a final important point that's subject to heavy debate, I would say, relates to the potential introduction of what is called the so-called EU interest test. And the EU interest test would apply in such a way that a foreign subsidy that is found to potentially distort or be distortive of the internal market would nevertheless be considered allowed because it pursues or it fulfills a certain EU interest. Now, we're struggling to see how that would work in practice. We've heard the different opinions about, ministerial approvals, overruling approvals. We had the Franco-German manifesto, I think, in merger control area that advocated also to bring in, those non-merger control or competition related aspects in merger control. I think we'll see a lot of those issues, practical issues, in the implementation here as well. It's going to be very difficult from my perspective to really set the thresholds of that EU interest. If we take this very simple example of guaranteeing certain labor places, how many labor places have to be guaranteed to tip the balance, in favor of a certain foreign subsidy that, for example, can be very distortive. So it's a process that from our perspective and from the industry perspective will very soon become very political, and therefore it's not something that we desire to see. Now, obviously, it are early days, so let's see what happens. I think it's a good addition to whatever the Commission cannot deal with under state aid rules, whatever cannot be dealt with under WTO rules. So yes, it's a welcome change and it's a welcome proposal, but under the condition, obviously, that we're not moving to overregulation here, which indeed might have a chilling effect on investment in Europe.
Thank you, Saar. Karin, you've been patiently listening and nodding at times. Do you agree with Saar that this proposal as drafted will inevitably see divergence in application on national level and political difficulties, or what are your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, there's a risk of that, but I will come into that later. Just start to thanks for having me on this panel together with these other distinguished panelists. I hope I will see all of you in real life in near time. This new I mean, the white paper is yet another step forward to ensure the fair conditions of competition in the internal market. And the Swedish Competition Authority has recently issued an opinion to the Swedish government, where it shared the Commission's general assessment that foreign subsidies can be problematic and that there appears to be a regulatory gap. And I think we agree on that. And therefore, there's a reason to consider introducing additional provisions which would ensure that all companies receiving a subsidy and operating in the internal market, regardless of their country of residence, enjoy equal rules of the game. And we highlighted in particular that all subsidies should be treated equally, regardless of whether they come from an EU country or from a country outside the EU. And when properly designed and used, I mean, state aid can contribute to competitiveness and welfare. And this applies regardless of the origin of the aid. And at the same time, we think it's important that the design of new complementary rules doesn't reduce foreign companies' incentives to operate in the internal market, and thereby reducing the positive impact of competition on the growth and competitiveness of European companies. However, it seems that the considerations, as Saar also put forward in the white paper, they are at a very early stage, and further analysis will be required in order to fully assess the effects of the proposals that might have on competition. And we see a need for further discussions on whether new regulatory tools should be introduced to deal with these distortive foreign subsidies. And of course, as any competition authority, we always support an undistorted competition situation where the most efficient companies have the conditions to grow and become successful. And this leads also to welfare through well-functioning markets, which is the guiding principle of the Swedish Competition Authority's work. And just a comment on the proposed models, I think overall we consider that the introduction of any new legal instruments should always be carefully weighed against risks that may entail for the efficiency of competition and also for public procurement in the internal market. And therefore, thorough impact assessment is needed. And I think it's very important, as Saar also pointed out, to have a predictable and transparent system with clear criteria in order to be able to establish that the foreign subsidy has caused or risks causing distortion. And looking at the white paper proposals, we see, for instance, challenges when it comes to the supervisory authority's ability to review information on subsidies that are granted in foreign countries that may distort competition within the EU. And similar difficulties occur today in competition investigations, for example, when conduct that affects competition within the EU takes place outside. And looking at the three models that are proposed in the white paper, we, just like Saar, we considered that a general tool based on model 1 appears to be the most appropriate and relevant to explore further, which means a general system where the supervisory authority can prioritize which investigations to be conducted rather than the other models that are based on a prior notification system. I think that's much more difficult to achieve. We also think that consideration should be given to granting exclusive competence to the Commission to apply the general tool based on Model 1. So I was thinking about Saar's comment there. And the reason, of course, is because the introduction of a new regulatory framework requires uniform application. And it can be quite a challenge if national supervisory authorities are given supervisory assignments already at the launch of this new instrument, and something that didn't take place in the field of competition, where member states have gradually given the competence to apply the EU competition rules. And the Commission's exclusive competence and experience in the field of state aid would point in the same direction. Just looking at the Model 1 in more detail, I mean, as we understand it, under this model, there would be no permanent ban on distortive foreign subsidies. There would also be no requirement for a prior notification of foreign subsidies that favor undertakings in the EU. The competent supervisory authorities could take relevant measures only after they have found that foreign subsidies have resulted in a distortion. And our understanding is that both the Commission and the national member states authorities would have a shared competence to enforce Model 1, but that the Commission would have an exclusive right to apply the proposed test, where the distortion is to be weighed against any positive EU interest. And we think, of course, that the proposed EU test, where EU political goals can become an assessment factor, can make it quite difficult to predict the result of the authorities' investigations and assessments. And therefore, it needs to be clear that which principles and also which assessment criteria are applied in each case. And it's important that this instrument doesn't become a tool for protectionism or for defending or protecting industries other than those that are already protected by other legislation. It's also proposed that foreign subsidies below a certain threshold should be considered unproblematic, as they are unlikely to cause distortions in the internal market. However, what is an appropriate threshold value can vary depending on the type of industry. So one possibility would be to have a general threshold value, but to give the supervisory authority the possibility to intervene in justified cases, even when the threshold values haven't been exceeded. And so that might be something to explore further. And it's obvious that the model needs to be further developed and properly designed. We believe maybe it might also cover problems that the proposal is intended to address in the model 2 and 3, but we'll see to that. But to conclude, I just also want to say that we do share also the Swedish government's general opinion, and that is that this type of distortion of competition would be addressed more efficiently by creating globally harmonized rules. And if we go ahead with this proposal for a unilateral instrument, it should therefore be designed with the aim of leading to a multilateral framework for subsidies. And hopefully the election in the US will turn out in a way that there are some possibilities to have international cooperation regarding this. So yes, I think I did answer some of Saar's concerns. Thank you, Evelina.
Thank you, Karin. And I wish we could spend a bit more time on this topic, but I think, we promised that we will spend a fair amount of this panel discussing the digital challenge, which we're now a little bit squeezed for time to do. So I suggest we move directly to it. And I'm sure the audience is well aware of the fact that the European Commission has put forward the Digital Services Act and also the new competition tool known as the Digital Markets Act. And so we do have those two acronyms, the DSA and the DMA, also known as NCT. And there's a lot of proposals in there that I think is already steering a lot of discussion. And let's have a bit of that now. Silke, do you want to kick off?
Yes, thank you very much, Evelina. Totally different again, the issue. I think that Cristina, at the beginning of our panel, already sketched very well the dimensions of the issue, and I maybe just let me make a few comments on what we are talking about in the German debate currently with our 10th Amendment of the German Competition Act. In a certain sense, I think, at least with regard to the public debate, our discussions are already a bit longer ongoing in explicit terms than the DSA, DMA, NCT debate. Of course, the Commission has been discussing that already for a long time internally, but it was not so much public at that time. And in this non-public period, our 10th Amendment already took first forms, and we actually have we will most probably have a new provision in our law that will allow us to do something that, yes, as Cristina said, is something like competition law plus, or bridging a bit the gaps between regulation and competition law. And maybe just to, let me say that at the start, I think this is a good way to approach this, because I really find it difficult to see that we will be able to regulate all of this, what we are talking about in the digital area. The digitalization goes through all economy, and it's, you can try to point only at specific platforms, but what they do usually goes into so many other areas of the economy that I feel we would be having lots of strange competency debates if this would all be removed from competition law. So I'm rather glad about this approach in Germany. This section 19a, as it's called, will allow the Bundeskartellamt to designate companies that have a paramount significance for competition across markets. That's the idea. And this whole idea comes from the fact that the companies in the digital world we are talking about usually have developed to be ecosystems with gatekeeper functions, and their position is one which is not any longer adequately addressed if you look at specific markets. That's why we have this across market approach, I think is really important. Taking into the factors that we will be able to take into account when designating such a company of paramount significance for competition across markets sounds rather familiar. We will be looking at dominance. We can assess financial and human and further resources, look at integration, vertical integration in businesses on connected markets. We can look at access to data, gatekeeper functions, especially with regard to access to markets by third parties. But all of this we will be looking at in a holistic manner and with an emphasis on this across markets aspect. So we are not going to be delineating markets in order to decide whether or not to designate a company to be of such paramount importance. And then the basic idea is, in a second phase, we will the law will have a number of prohibitions that we will be able to activate from company to company and make specific as need be. That's basically a bit the setting of this provision. There is a lot of debate on this. It's currently in the parliamentary debate. Actually, we are very well, it's very interesting to see what the parliamentaries will have to say to all of this, whether they also agree to this approach of being able to be bold, but maybe also very differentiated. And I think that's a bit the idea behind this approach. Maybe I'll leave it at that, and here I listen to what the others have to say on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Silke. I wish we could discuss that a little bit more, but I think we do want to talk a little bit about the NTC DMA and the DSA. And
yes,
Monique, the Netherlands have also been sort of trying to pioneer some of the thought leadership on these topics with the Benelux statement. And I don't know if you want to say a few words about that, and if you had any reflections on the proposals put forward by the Commission.
The Benelux statement seems already so long ago. That's a topic we keep on pointing. Things are going fast, but I'll try to be short. I think it will come to no surprise when I say that the ACM favors the introduction of some forms of ex-ante intervention, which allows the authorities to impose tailored and effective remedies in markets where large digital platforms operate. We do not support the opinion that all can be fixed by competition law or 102. And I do not see any reasons to wait, an aspect which was raised by Cristina before, and think that things should be taken care of at more of an EU level. And therefore we welcome as an ACM the initiatives of the Commission for both a Digital Service Act and a new competition tool. And we contributed to this discussion on the basis of our experience, both as a competition law enforcer, but also as a regulator in the telecoms market. As you mentioned, the Benelux initiative that was in 2019, then we published a paper calling for options to take ex-ante actions against digital platforms before irreparable harm could be inflicted on the markets. We have subsequently contributed to the consultations, both directly by response as the ACM, but also indirectly by the response through BEREC, which is the network of telecoms regulators in Europe. In our response to the consultations, we described several situations where the existing toolkit may be insufficient, and that's, for example, in situations where platforms act as a gatekeeper, or where market dynamics point to a winner-takes-it-all tendency. And in those situations, which of course have to be described and defined precisely, but in those situations, a new toolkit that includes a list of principle-based obligations and clear prohibitions will be a solution if, in addition, it also allows for fast ex-ante interventions. When it comes to the remedies, they should be non-punitive in nature, although failing to comply with the remedies should be sanctionable. They should be tailor-made on a case-by-case basis and temporary, and the requirements imposed should be focused on changing the market structure or preventing certain behavior to take place. Then I think when it comes to procedures, a procedural perspective is something important. Might work if we work with rebuttable assumptions and hardcore prohibited practices that may add to speediness, which is something I think which was addressed already by Elsa, which is very important for a business as such. Enforcement, I think, can take place at European level, because most of these problems are companies work out throughout the internal market, so that would be most effective. Although also the opportunity should be given to the national enforcers, because in certain cases we do have similar problems which take place only at a national level. So that's my first reaction on this topic. Thank you.
Karin, what are your views? Do you agree with Monique? What else do you have to offer in terms of insight?
Well, first of all, we always have a close collaboration with our neighboring countries, and in order to contribute to the ongoing policy discussion, maybe not as well known as the Benelux statement, but the Nordic competition authorities recently published a joint memorandum entitled Digital Platforms and the Potential Changes to Competition Law at the European level. And overall, we encourage a harmonized approach to any regulatory efforts to avoid fragmentation and to safeguard the effective functioning of digital markets. We believe that an EU-wide process will guarantee a higher level of harmonization and transparency, which are crucial for preserving a level playing field in the single market. At the same time, in our report, we stress the importance of duly considering the advantages and risks that are associated with such new regulatory interventions for companies and also for consumers, and the need to protect legal certainty and also to ensure predictability. Establishing an ex-ante regulatory framework that digital platforms acting as gatekeepers must comply with would have the benefit of an immediate effect, since the framework could replace some of the need for long and resource-intensive competition cases, thus facilitating timely intervention and also avoiding the risk of irreparable harm to competition. However, there's a risk that such a regulatory intervention may not ensure the same level of flexibility and adaptability seen in the enforcement of competition law. And in particular, we need to carefully examine if it would be actually beneficial to introduce a detailed list of obligations and prohibitions within an ex-ante regulatory framework. And this is because, I mean, the same type of conduct can have both pro and anti-competitive effects depending on the market and also on the specific gatekeepers, and because digital markets are fast moving. So that's one of the reasons. And what is more, such a regulatory intervention should also rely, of course, on a clear and objective set of criteria. It needs to be clear which companies are considered to be digital gatekeepers, so that companies are able to foresee which type of regulation they will be subject to. The complexity and variety of business models adopted by digital platforms, together with the high pace of innovation that characterizes this dynamic sector, make the establishment of clear-cut ex-ante criteria a very challenging task. Nevertheless, I think a lack of clarity on these points may not only affect the rights of the companies involved, but also diminish trust from companies and hamper incentives to invest and to innovate. And in our report, we also recognize that the introduction of a new market investigation tool has the potential to bring certain advantages at the European level, including, of course, the possibility to develop a more holistic approach that tackles different aspects of the market concern. And the new tool could also allow for structural issues to be addressed, such as oligopolistic markets that may facilitate anti-competitive behavior. At the same time, the proposed investigation tool would mark a significant enlargement of Commission's powers of intervention, thus requiring adequate safeguards and proportionality checks. And in this sense, we believe that there are a series of procedural and substantive issues that have to be carefully considered, including the legal standard adopted, the level of engagement of the undertakings involved, and also the importance of engagement of relevant competition authorities. For instance, in relation to the threshold test for initiating an investigation, we believe that there's a need to establish a clear legal framework capable of mitigating potential uncertainty on the part of the companies. As we see now, indications that this new market investigation tool would focus on digital markets. One of our concerns, for instance, is related to the fact that more and more sectors are demonstrating digital elements as a result of ongoing digitalization process. And in our report from 2017, we suggested that this development raises the question of whether it really makes sense to draw a distinction between e-commerce and regular commerce in the future. And if the scope of the proposed new tool is limited only to digital markets, I think this could potentially give rise to very complex demarcation issues. Thank you, Evelina.
Thank you, Karin. Cristina, so you were the one who sort of, went for some bold statements in the beginning, and let's see if you have more bold statements for the end of the session.
Oh yes, you heard nothing. I'm going to go even bolder. So look, I think that it's all very well, and of course I understand business wants predictability, and that's all fine, and we've all heard that for 100 years. Now, the reality of it, though, is that, hey, we have under-enforced, right? Particularly in the digital space. Let's just not hide behind that. We have not done enough, and this is why we're in the position we're in. So I personally think that I don't worry so much about this kind of pushback that you inevitably get from people saying, but if you do something which is a little bit over-enforcement, then you're going to kill innovation. Listen, there is no economic foundation to that statement. There is no economic research that shows that if you are enforcing, you kill innovation. This is an old chestnut that the defendants have used forever. I was in the Microsoft case in 1999, and Microsoft was saying at the time, if you enforce against us, we will absolutely cease innovating. And obviously the rest is history. So it isn't the case. Competition drives innovation. Hello, monopolies don't innovate enough. We want to see more innovation, more competition. The only competition is that. And so to the extent that a regulation and enforcement can lead us towards more competition, that is good for innovation that drives productivity and growth. So if we make an occasional type 2 error, we enforce what we shouldn't have done, who's going to die? Personally, I think if you block a merger occasionally, which maybe could have gone through, but you block it, so what? The startup will go IPO, will send itself somewhere else, will do something organic, and the platform will have to innovate organically. So I personally think it's not a big deal. Now, the question, though, is important as to the way we do it. I agree that one needs to try and do things in a smart way and not in a dumb way. And so I certainly think that we need to be incredibly careful about the way we formulate the regulation, okay? Because I do worry about, for example, an approach which is telco style, okay? In telcos, you have business models that are pretty much the same. You have British Telecom and France Telecom and Telecom Italia at the time not being enormously different from one another. And so you can kind of come along with rules that are applicable across the piece. But in digital, you have very different types of business models. Some are funded, some are transaction platforms, some are matchmaking, some are device funded, some are some sort of commerce platform, and they are not really susceptible to be regulated in a completely uniform way. So for example, when we do make statements like no self-preferencing, which I completely, totally subscribe to, there is the follow-on question, which is, but what does it mean in the case of each individual platform? So, okay, in the case of an ad-funded platform, you're talking about something which directs traffic. So self-preferencing is directing traffic away from other people's services to your own. Fine. What does it mean in the case of a device-funded platform? What does it mean in the case of an e-commerce platform? I worry that, you know, making these kind of general category-based statements, no self-preferencing, no anti-competitive use of data, is not sufficiently precise when it comes to having, and it will move the conversation and the pushback of the defense to years of disagreement about what this actually means. So in the end, you cannot do away with case by case. And this is why you need antitrust at the same time. Now, the problem with antitrust is on the other hand, that I've been frustrated with it because I don't think we're using the tool quite as effectively and fully as we could. I've been saying for years, why do we try and fit everything into an exclusion leverage Microsoft type box, right? When you used to show up, I used to show up at the commission and say, there's this great case. Does it look like Microsoft? No, we're not doing it. It just has to look like Microsoft, otherwise we're not doing it, sorry. And so it needs to be something where we accept that the real problem we are faced with is unfair bargains. It's exploitation in many of these cases. You having the rights of citizens, the rights of companies as such, dealt with in a way that is unfair, and they cannot do, nothing can be done about it. So I do think that that needs to be piled up, and I continue to see reluctance on the part of many agencies. Now, I think that in Germany, this is actually going in the right direction. France has actually adopted a view of exploitation in a number of cases, but not elsewhere. So I think France and Germany are doing the right thing. The UK is certainly very militant, particularly in the merger space, and I think that's a good thing. But there could be more that could be done in antitrust using the exploitation tool better and using interim measures more, because of course speed is of the essence. So we're all going to sit here and we're all going to sit worrying about what you know, are we waiting another 6 years before anything happens? So, and finally, I think that you know, this is something which again in the UK is being looked at quite carefully. The merger approach is not sufficiently well looked at, I think, in Europe at COMP, the concern around mergers. We keep talking about we can't unscramble the eggs once they have been scrambled. Well, why are we scrambling them in the first place? We know that merger enforcement has been incredibly permissive. There have been gerrymandered remedies that have allowed all sorts of bad stuff to go through, not just in digital, but more generally. And so I think that a big, serious reconsideration of the standard there needs to be implemented, particularly in digital, where we don't have a clear sense for what it is that will unfold. And in some sense, I'm in favor of saying, you know, we take a view. Some of these things are just not permitted, and good luck. Go and innovate. Go and create an equivalent service yourself. Why do you have to eat this company and then kill its innovation or kill yours, which is a reverse killer acquisition? So I think that there will be finally quite a lot still to be thought through, and the relationship also between institutionally the various components is unclear, and how things will sit together as between DigiConnect and DigiConf is still an area which I'm not at all clear about. I think no one is clear about. Philip Marsden and Ruprecht have written a very good paper about institutions relationship, which I think is trying to make progress, but where does this regulator sit? Is it an EU regulator for platforms, or are we delegating to the telco regulators in the various countries? These are the big questions that are going to have to be met. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. And we are right at the end of our allocated slot, but I feel it would be utterly unfair if we didn't give in-house speakers to reflect on you know, whether authorities should not scramble the eggs at all.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts?
As Cristina has so eloquently said, there's no doubt that the devil is going to be in the detail of any regulation that is coming. And I'm sure she'll find this very tedious, but I think nonetheless it does bear repeating that there are really some very core principles to bear in mind from the business perspective to make this workable. Some practical reflections there that you know, the design of any new regulation is going to have to be extremely careful to limit unintended consequences. We're going to need to be very careful that regulation has to be considered as a whole, complementary, internally consistent with what's there already, what's coming, and you know, both at EU level, but member state level, etc., etc. And you know, difficult as it will be, regulation needs to be extremely well targeted so that it can capture all the situations where it is required, but only those situations where it is required. And also that it remains sufficiently flexible to capture novel problematic situations that sitting around this table today, none of us can see coming, or this will all have been something of a waste of time. Who it captures and how it captures them needs to be clear. And in order to be effective, we need to be addressing not just the source, you know, in the digital sphere of, let's say, of a market's power, but also to manage its effects. Otherwise, it would be futile or even worse, actively harmful to competition. And again, you know, comments that have been made that I think should be picked up and reinforced here. That once the framework is established, enforcement does need to be swift and it needs to be decisive, but it also needs to be balanced and accurate. Supported by effective and efficient monitoring. And the regime needs to be smart, as has been said. It needs to be strategic to reduce the chances that it can be gamed or unduly delayed, etc., both by complainants and also by defendants. And that it's not, you know, one can't easily raise spurious smokescreen arguments such as GDPR, data privacy, etc., that are irrelevant but, you know, important red herrings that can throw off the scent of a real trail. And then my final comment would just be, of course, you know, as any business would want to see here, and I think any lawyer, anyone with an interest in justice, that the procedural safeguards and due process will need to be built in from the very beginning and into the very core of any new regime. So we have reasonable timeframes, burdens and standards of proof, standards of care that are imposed on companies to whom the regulations applies, and adequate checks and balances so that we can always ensure that all rights of defence are properly maintained. That would be my 10 cents worth.
Thank you, Elsa. And we're really at the very end of the time. So I will invite Silke, Saar, Monique, and Karin to just make a one-sentence call, like a tweet. What is the silver bullet for European competitiveness from your point of view? Silke, you start. Really briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. Well, I think we need to keep alert. We need to understand new developments, and we need to, in fact, to enforce competition law effectively.
Saar?
I guess there's no just one single bullet here. I agree with Silke. I think what's important is that competition authorities should really understand the problems on the market. I think I would wish that we see much more dialogue with the stakeholders and with the industry. I think that would definitely help. And then again, and at the risk of Cristina disagreeing with me, I really can advise against over-regulation because it just scares companies away. And I think, again, as I mentioned, we need to find the right balance there.
I think she's asking for more enforcement rather than over-regulation, but well, that's just my interpretation. Monique. I think, Monique, you're on mute.
There I am, yeah? There I am.
Go ahead, but
Short.
really quickly now.
That was really quick. Short keywords are, for me, speeding up procedures and integrated approach. To explain, I think if competition law will remain important and will play a role, but if you want to be relevant, I think we have to be able to speed up proceedings. And I think we can all play a role there to remain inventative and pull together our collective responsibility there. Second, competition law may not always be the silver bullet. An integrated approach from different angles may be more best for society, better for society. So it's not only competition, it's also consumer protection, also other regulation, including even privacy. So sometimes one set of rules will be sufficient, but more often I think nowadays it will be an integrated set of rules and therefore also will require cooperation between various institutions. We've seen in COVID we can do a lot to cooperate. We should keep up that spirit also after the corona crisis.
Thank you, Monique. Karin.
Yes, and I'm in the same line. I think we need to remember that question of ensuring a global level playing field is not exclusively a competition policy question. I think competition and not politics should help identify the winners among European firms and ensuring the level playing field. And I think that is, we should be very careful with diluting and politicizing competition supervision. It's flattering, but I don't think it's clear that competition authorities are the best place to make these decisions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And there is also a comment from the audience which says that if ex-ante regulation is adopted, we need to ensure that it is revised on a periodic basis with dialogue with industry and with proper evidence of results, from Patricia Vidal. With that, I conclude. I thank you all very much. I thought we covered a lot of ground. I personally enjoyed it tremendously, and I hope the audience enjoyed it just as much.